Question 20. What are the advantages of Java config and what are the limitations? We will have a look at the advantages of Java config over the XML config and also of the advantages of Java config over annotation-based config. And then we will look at the limitations of Java config. So first advantage of Java config over the XML config is that Java config supports the compile time feedback due to type checking. And let's go into the code. Let me show what I mean by this. So open the question 20 example, and in the question 20 example, let's go to the Java config one. Over here, I have free Spring Beans configured, and also I will have one message digest bean configured, which I will show at the end. So when I have a Spring Bean 1, the Spring Bean 1 has a dependency to Spring Bean 2 and also to Spring Bean 3. Now, let's say that I'm making a mistake during this bean configuration and I mismatch the type. So instead of doing Spring Bean 2, I'm doing Spring Bean 3. And if I would try to compile this code now, you will see that the Java compiler will throw an error over here because it sees that the types are incompatible. So instead of finding out on the runtime after the compilation and after executing the project that something is wrong over here, I'm finding the issue soon in the process. So I'm filing fast, and compile time feedbacks gives me the information that something has to be corrected. And when working on the big projects, when the source code is huge, it is important to have type checking like this. It really helps to develop application faster. Now, if you would go into the XML example, then we can see that the Spring Beans are over here. However, the definition of the beans and the description of the beans is in the XML file. And this XML file is basically a regular file that will be included on the class path of the application, and then Spring will load this beans XML from the class path. However, normally it's not being checked, especially it's not checked by the compiler. Now, because I'm using the IntelliJ Ultimate Edition, it contains the additional plugins which will do the checking for me. So if I would make the same mistake over here, then IntelliJ will say that something is incorrect over here, but this is only because I have Ultimate Edition and because I have plugins installed for this. But if you are using some different IDE that does not have support for the Spring, you will not see this. It will be just a regular XML file. So now if I would try to compile this code, as you can see, this code compiled correctly. And now I can even run this code, but it will fail during the runtime. So over here you can see that there is an exception with creating of a bean, and you have a unsatisfied dependency. The parameter 0 cannot be converted to from Spring Bean 3 to Spring Bean 2. And when working on the big project, this is actually an issue if you are finding the problems late in the process after the compilation during the runtime, because we want to find those kind of issues as soon as possible. So this is why over here the Java config helps, because even without having additional plugins and additional tools, we will have a file-fast approach, and the compile time feedback will give us information that something is wrong. The next thing is that refactoring tools for Java will work out of the box, and also you do not need to have any special plugins if you are using the Java config. And let's have a look at the examples once again. And I will run this one. It runs correctly. And let's say that during the refactoring, we want to move one bean into different package. So I will create the package ext over here, and I will just move it. And as you can already see, IntelliJ did modify my beans XML file. And again, this is because I have the Ultimate Edition, and because this Ultimate Edition supports Spring, and it knows that this is a configuration of the Spring Bean, so it will also update this during the refactoring. But if you have the IDE that does not support those functionalities, then it will be like this. This XML will not change. And now if I would try to compile this code, then this code will compile correctly. And I will be able to run this code, but at runtime it will fail. And it's failing with the class not found exception because Spring tries to find the Spring Bean free, which I have moved to the different package. So if you will work with the IDE that does not have support for Spring, then you will need to modify all of those automatically. While doing the same in the Java config will work out of the box, because in Java config we are generally working with the default Java code, so every IDE will work with this. Now let's have a look at the advantages of Java config over the annotation-based config. So the first advantage is a separation of the concerns. It means that the Bean configuration is separated from the Bean implementation. And over here we can see this example. We have the application config. All of the beans are configured over here. However, each of the bean implementation does not have any information that it's a component, what is the scope for the bean, etc. All of those informations will be over here. The next advantage is that we can achieve something that is called technology agnostic approach, and that means that Bean definitions are not dependent on a concrete inversion of control dependency injection implementation, and this makes us easier to switch to the different technology. And it's because if we will look at those Spring Beans, then none of those are actually having any dependency directly on the Spring framework. They are being managed by the Spring framework, but all of those beans do not even know about this, because all of the configuration is over here, and we do not have any dependency even on the annotation. The next thing, and I think it's a huge thing about the Java config, that it allows you to integrate Spring with external libraries. And I have this example over here. I'm using the SHA-384 hash from the Apache Commons codec utils. And because it's not part of the Spring framework, this class is not a Spring Bean. But I can make it a Spring Bean pretty easily by creating a method and then returning a new object from this library. And as soon as I will do that, then Spring will manage this message digest as a bean. And I have an example over here that Spring Bean free is dependent on the message digest. So if I will run this example, first it will create a Spring Bean 1, and Spring Bean 1 is listing the dependencies over here. And then I have Spring Bean 3 that is printing the hash over here. And this message digest is not injected by me, but this message digest is injected by Spring, even though it's not a Spring framework part, but it's managed by the Spring because we have declared it in the Java config. And the next advantage is that it allows you to do more centralized location of the bean list. So normally when using the component scanning, all of the Spring Beans will be spread around within the project, so sometimes it might be a challenge to know how many beans do you have, what depends on what, etc. There are some workarounds for this, because for example IntelliJ Ultimate Edition supports those functionalities, so it can create a map, the graphical map of all of your beans with all of the dependencies. However, if you do not have IDE like this, then sometimes having more centralized configuration helps, because you know what is in the system and you know what will be in the context. It's just easier to read. Now, the limitations of the Java configuration is that configuration class cannot be final, and also none of the methods cannot be final. And the reason for this is that when you have this configuration, then under the hood, it will actually not work with the configuration class directly. Instead, the cglib proxy will be created for this, and then Spring will invoke this class through the cglib proxy. So let me do a breakpoint over here and let me explain what will happen over here. So as you can see, when Spring is requesting the Spring Bean1, it's actually not working on the application config class, but it's working on the application config enhanced by Spring cglib. And Spring is doing that because if we have a default scope that is singleton, then we do not want to create the Spring Bean1 a few times. We want to have only one instance. And this is why this proxy will be used over here to guard this behavior that this can be invoked only once. And because the cglib has this limitation that it cannot work with the final class, if we would try to make it a final class, then it will fail with this exception, the offending resource. If I would try to make the method final, that it will fail as well. And as you can see, we also had the exception. And also the advantages of the Java config is that it allows you to do more like a centralized location of the bean list, but also it might be a disadvantage. So if you are working with the big application and you have a lot of beans in your system, sometimes listing all of those beans might create a lot of code, and it might be hard to navigate. So on one hand, it's good to have it centralized. On the other hand, with the big projects, it might be a challenge.